My name is Ben Barry, and I'm a fourth-year student here at the University of Virginia. On behalf of Theological Horizons, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Schaeffer Lecture in Christian Thought. I'm so glad that you're joining us in the beautiful dome room here in the Rotunda. We're in for an amazing afternoon, as you can probably already tell, thanks to the fantastic altar quartet. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for sharing your talents with us. We're very grateful that you're joining us for this special event. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome up Karen Wright Marsh, the Executive Director of Theological Horizons. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It is my great honor to welcome all of you here this afternoon for the 4th Annual Schaeffer Lecture in Christian Thought. Our topic tonight, or this afternoon, is Open, Honest, and Free, a celebration of theological inquiry across the university, featuring our own Professor Charles Marsh. This is an offering of Theological Horizons. We aim to serve believers and all spiritually curious people by providing a warm and welcoming community for engaging faith, thought, and life here at the University of Virginia and beyond. On this March afternoon, we are especially grateful to come together with you, a vibrant community of family, of friends, of different people, of different communities who have been a part of Theological Horizons, or maybe this is your first time with us, and we welcome you. Some of you have been with us since our beginnings here at UVA 25 years ago. It's our 25th anniversary, and others have come along the way. Our motto is all welcome always, and that we mean that. So we come to engage in this vital exploration of what it means to pursue theological inquiry in ways that are open, honest, and free here in our university culture and beyond. As you've already heard, this program is graced by the incredibly gifted student musicians of the Altair Quartet, university students Amina Sabeh, Phoebe Hall, Justin Park, and Lynn Park. You'll hear from them again in a moment. You will see a short film from another friend, filmmaker Drew Precious, and you will meet Professor Nichole Flores, who will introduce Dr. Charles Marsh. So I have no doubt that this will be a terrific time together and you will leave feeling enriched and challenged. But first, I'd like to express my gratitude always to the Project on Lived Theology at UVA, a research initiative whose mission it is to study the social consequences of theological ideas for the sake of a more just and compassionate world. I thank them for their partnership in this event. I thank Sherry Winston, the director for the Rotunda, for her amazing hospitality to us this afternoon. I thank the donors, the partners, the leaders of Theological Horizons, to board members past and present here today, to my most amazing colleagues who have brought this event into being. On behalf of all of us, I especially thank our beloved Steve and Nancy Schaeffer, and of course Julia, for being the visionary founders of this Schaeffer Lecture in Christian Thought. Your generosity is what brings us here together today. We are grateful for your faithful commitment to Theological Horizons and to the entire UVA community. Steve, would you come to the podium and offer a few words? Thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Charles. And Nancy and Julia and I are very pleased to support the Schaeffer Lecture in Christian Thought series, which brings together leaders to UVA to explore the breadth of Christian thought in science, medicine, culture, and the arts, from Kate Bowler, Brian Stevenson, and David Brooks, to today's speaker, my friend Charles Marsh. The Schaeffer Lecture series is one way that we can foster the vision of Theological Horizons, to create a space for rigorous thought, curiosity, and hospitality across the university and the wider community. As a way of sparking our thinking around theological inquiry, I have the pleasure of introducing a brand new 5-minute film on the topic of faith exploration on college campuses. You're getting the first look at a larger multimedia project by Theological Horizons that is generously funded by the Lloyd and Vivian Noble Foundation. So, enjoy the film.
For me, college was the first time that I really began to think critically and began to ask, what do I believe?
I think the important thing is to ask questions about who do they really want to be, and not just what it looks like on paper and what it sounds like when someone asks you. What values make you who you are, and what are your values?
You're being challenged academically in ways that you may have been before or you may not have been before. And so you end up being confused a lot, or at least I was.
It really helped me in my faith journey to have these forums for conversation, not just how do I solve this one differential equation, but why am I solving this differential equation? What's the purpose of work? How am I cultivating the earth?
One of my first ever large groups from first year was this idea of who are you becoming? And that has been a question that has stuck with me ever since. It's something that I wrote on a sticky note and taped to my mirror every year in college. It's something that I have on a sticky note taped to my desk at work.
I didn't want to be only around people who were in the same stage of life as me, who maybe had similar career aspirations. I wanted to be in the reality of life, which is much more full and rich than that.
Being able to go through that process of both self-discovery and discernment communally is what made it a really powerful time for me, and I think for a lot of other people.
I think the strongest faith is the one that you have examined and made your own. And that may lead you in a lot of different directions, but it'll be the one that serves you.
Two sons. One of the things that was very evident to me was the role that guides, mentors, influential teachers, directors in theater or athletic coaches, the role that they played in their life. And so much of that from a faith perspective.
If students are not asked big enough questions, they will not have the opportunity to develop worthy enough dreams that can command all of their efforts and imagination and intelligence.
Every student generation is shaped by the culture of their growing up, different curiosities, different suspicions, and so you have to meet each generation where they are.
They may come very mentally career-driven and focused. That'll get you somewhere for a while, but then eventually you're going to burn out. You know, if you come, socially to have a great time, that'll get you there for a while, but then that weighs out.
If it's done well, right, if people are embracing the university setting as a space of inquiry, a space of the exchange of ideas, and a space of mutual sharpening, I think that gives us tools for once we leave that space. Right? So as people of faith, we can now enter into the world beyond our academic formation and not be thrown off when we encounter someone who is different from us, but to actually have already been equipped to engage in that difference in a way that can be mutually productive.
I've found that there are a lot of people at the university that want to talk about their faith, that want to hear talks from a faith perspective, that want to learn.
I came to my faith through critical thinking because of UVA, because of Theological Horizons.
That's the reason why Theological Horizons is so important, because it provides a welcoming, non-judgmental space for students and faculty to be able to do that.
As a parent of college students, seeing how hard my students are working, how much they want to succeed, the pressures they face as they work out their life on their own in college, I can't tell you what it means to know that there are people, loving, wonderful, beautiful people who are setting the table for them in creating a safe, loving environment to sort of welcome them in where they can rest and ask important questions.
What a treat. It is my distinct honor to introduce Charles Marsh as the 2025 Schaeffer Lecturer. Dr. Marsh is the UVA Commonwealth Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Project on Lived Theology. Some of his many wonderful books include Evangelical Anxiety, a memoir, The Beloved Community, God's Long Summer, Stories of Faith and Civil Rights, which won the 1998 Grawemeyer Award in Religion, and Strange Glory, A Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which won the Christianity Today Book Award in Biography History in 2015. Charles is beloved spouse to Karen Wright Marsh, whose leadership of Theological Horizons brings us together today. I have been friends with Charles and colleagues in the Religious Studies Department since I first arrived at UVA a decade ago. Can you believe that? 10 years. Upon my arrival in Charlottesville, Dr. Marsh immediately invited me to be involved with the writing of a wonderful volume, Can I Get a Witness? 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice. To that volume, Charles invited me to contribute a chapter on Miss Ella Baker. As a freshly minted PhD at the time, I assumed that Dr. Marsh was asking me to share from my scholarly expertise in Catholic social thought as a lens for interpreting Miss Baker's extraordinary work. But he was asking me to do something much more demanding. Charles and his wonderful co-editors wanted each chapter of the volume to illuminate lived Christian witness, an embodied witness that speaks louder than abstract theories or theological speculation. He didn't want a theological book report on Ella Baker's life. He wanted my theology to bear witness with Miss Baker's life and witness. The essay for that volume remains one of the most difficult ones I have ever written, but it was one of the most important things I have ever written too. It was a lesson in so many of the things that Charles brings to us tonight and through his own life and witness. It was a lesson in writing biography and memoir, crucial theological skills that are often neglected or outright rejected in theological training in our times. It was a lesson in interlacing theology with the study of history, the social sciences, the arts, not simply as elite forms of academic expression, but as elements of telling compelling, textured stories of lived faith. Above all, it was a lesson in allowing my own faith to animate the work and vocation of theology. I spent more time writing and rewriting that essay than any work I had done before, but at the end of all of that work, I had learned to do theology as a witness rather than as a bystander. Charles has dedicated his life to inviting students, colleagues, and fellow travelers to live their theology in precisely this way. Charles's invitation to a lived theology of witness is more relevant now than ever. His life, work, and witness rejects the abiding temptation to shield ourselves from the suffering of our communities, our countries, and our world. His work holds up a mirror to those of us who claim to love God's justice, revealing how we often cloak ourselves in privilege, power, and cheap grace. Now more than ever, his witness exhorts us to remember the witnesses of Bonhoeffer and Baker, of King and Gutierrez, of Berrigan and Huerta, living our shared Christian faith as a life of witness to the good news of Jesus Christ. So for these reasons, it is just such an honor to have been asked to introduce my friend, my colleague, a mentor. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Marsh.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. As your biggest fanboy, I am speechless. What a beautiful introduction. Thank you. And thanks for the two of you for your gift to this remarkable community. I'm a Baptist boy, so I'm going to keep my black leather Thompson chain reference edition right here in case I need it. It is my great privilege to deliver the 2005 Schaeffer Family Lecture. It is an honor because, for many reasons, I have known the Schaeffer family since childhood. The Schaeffer family of Virginia Beach, Virginia, but also the Schaeffer family of Laurel, Mississippi. Your father, Vince, and your mother, Dell, were people of great integrity, who I recall with such affection from my years in Laurel. True Lincoln Republicans, honest and measured, and we miss them dearly. They were also faithful students of the Bible, and in many ways nurtured you with those sort of discernments and skills that give you a heart for this kind of event, this kind of patronage. And Nancy and Steve, your patronage is needed more today than ever. Your endeavor to cut through the cacophony of this nation of noisy believers, to try to recover the clarity of the gospel story. And I am grateful to be able to share my words today in the spirit of this family's life. So I want to begin just with an acknowledgement that Steve and I were childhood friends, and we were members of the First Baptist Church of Laurel, Mississippi, and classmates in Sunday school. Sunday school, of course, was one of the 5 or 6 requirements on a Sunday for Baptist kids of that era. And if there's a photograph available, I'd like to show you what I found in the archives this past week. Yes, we did have to wake up early on the Sunday morning and put our Sunday finest on. I think we were inspired both by the prospect of hot Shipley donuts and Coca-Colas, but also by solid Bible teaching by Jim Johnson here. Steve and I are standing next to each other. There's Garth Fisher in the front row, who would become a famous plastic surgeon in Hollywood. We could talk about this all day. And in the other part of the Sunday school building, we would share General Assembly, and then the boys would go off with Mr. Johnson, and then the girls would go off with the pretty lady with the white dress and the winning smile is my mother. Miss Central High School, Jackson, Mississippi, 1953. And while the boys were studying the Bible and learning how to live as a godly young man in the early 1970s, the girls had not gotten the memo that on miniskirts being a fashion accoutrement that really intruded into our pursuit of holiness and walk with Jesus. My mother would lead this class and teach these girls, these beautiful girls, most of whom I'm still friends with, how to be sunbeams for Christ and to help the young men along in their own struggles for holiness. And I would just say about these two photographs, one thing, my book, Evangelical Anxiety, is now available in paperback. So if you can see that connection between all of this and a Baptist boy growing up with the weight of the world on him. You know, I have, as a scholar of the South, written widely over the years of Christianity in that era, often as a diagnostician of the racial heresies of the Southern Evangelical Church. And I'll have some things to say about that today. But I also want to acknowledge my gratitude for the spiritual formation I received in the church. If you look back, we don't need to, but if you look closely in that photograph of the boys' Sunday school, you'll see that I'm holding a Bible in my right hand. It's this Bible, Mike Thompson chain reference, my gold monogram on the front, with annotations and 4 spiritual laws and autographs from Alabama football players gracing the margins. This Bible and the other Bibles that I carried with me, you know, this was where I learned to read. This was the first place that my mind opened to wonder and mystery. And though we Southern Baptists were zealous in many spiritual practices, in soul winning, in missions, observing the Sabbath, church life, ice cream socials, the Bible was the center of everything. The Bible was the source of my earliest and deepest education. It did open my mind, my small world, to mystery. It freed my imagination. It stirred it, excited it. And it bound virtues like honesty and patience and walking circumspect to the excellences of Christ. It was this Bible, these Bibles, my Living Bible, my Good News for Modern Man Bible, all of which I still have at home, that taught me how to read. My quiet times, daily from an early age, taught me to dig into the text, to dwell on a word or a phrase, to expect an encounter with speech and its evocations. Close reading of a passage, then, but also how to read the world, the cosmos, sacramentally, and how to read neighbors with compassion. When I read the Bible, the natural world became a place of wonder and signs. And I, the reader of the Bible, and the book of nature and the book of God, I was left helpless to do anything other than affirm God's beautiful creation and God's ability to speak to us through the winds and rainbows and storms. Friends, teachers, even kids who were mean to me, I could register anger at them as well as anyone. But the Bible, and especially St. Paul's letters, where I spent most of my time, pressed me to affirm that they are, as I am, sinners in need of forgiveness. And what other book could you open with the certainty that God would speak to you to the precise moment of your day, of your life? Steve and I were both born in 1958. That meant we were born into a South still living under the brutal arrangements of the Jim Crow caste system. A historian named James Silver, who taught at Ole Miss, at least until his book Mississippi, A Closed Society was published in 1964, described to the nation and the world in what became a surprise bestseller, a closed society in which most white people nonchalantly accepted the all-pervading doctrine of white supremacy, justified by a professed belief in states' rights and religious fundamentalism. In such a society, Professor Silver wrote, a never-ceasing propagation of the true faith must go on relentlessly with a constantly reiterated demand for loyalty to the united front, requiring that nonconformists and dissenters from the code be silenced or, in a crisis, driven out of the community. But on September 8th, 1970, on a sweltering hot morning, Steve and I joined our old classmates from the whites-only public schools and our new classmates from the black schools to be part of the first integrated public schools in Mississippi. It would take another Supreme Court case, this time Alexander versus Holmes County, which spoke directly to 30 school districts in Mississippi that had seized on the 1954 Brown versus Board decision and its phrase, all deliberate speed, as a means of forestalling desegregation until Jesus returned and then set up his eternal separate but equal kingdom, presumably. And it ordered the immediate termination of dual school systems and the establishment of unitary systems. School bells rang in a new era today, the UPI wire announced. Thousands of children began classes under new integration plans. Plenty of white parents were furious. The new realities pretended the end of the world as we knew it, and blamed families like mine and the Scopers for the monumental mess of the government schools. Later, I would learn that not a few black parents were unhappy with the decision as well for reasons related to the loss of black-run schools with black leadership for black students. But in the summer of 1970, there was no other way forward. The option exercised by many white Southerners of building segregated private schools, otherwise known as Christian academies, did not appeal to Laurel's Republican sensibilities. Over the years, I've thought of our efforts as something like the ordinary resoluteness of unintended heroism. The sons and daughters of civil rights activists and Klansmen, of circuit clerks and deputy sheriffs, of citizens counselors and black militants, of society matrons and union organizers, of preachers and geologists, linked together by time and circumstance, carrying the movement over the finish line. Sports was the obvious place where the new realities produced the most visible results. I would no longer be the fastest white kid in school. I would no longer be the fastest kid in school. I would be the fastest white kid in school. I would no longer anchor the 440 relay. I would run the third leg of the 440 relay, and what a joy that was, handing the baton off to Joe Porter, who was now the fastest kid in school and in Mississippi, and perhaps the South, who, once he got the baton from me, which was always, thanks, Nanu, this is what he said after the Disney character when they handed him the baton. Smoke. But the experience also unleashed new creative energies long muted, suppressed by the brutal arrangements of segregation. Until the public schools combined, for example, I'd never encountered the type of kid my age you might call an intellectual. But that changed when a boy named Jerome Johnson sashayed into honors history with his face buried in a book. I don't know if Jerome was uncommonly bright in physics or chemistry, but he was the closest thing to Jean-Paul Sartre I'd ever encountered in the flesh. And I knew what Jean-Paul Sartre looked like from the book in my father's office. Jerome didn't have the lazy eye, and nor did he chain smoke, but he wore a beret and black leather boots, and when the weather turned cold, he swept a paisley scarf around his neck. Though he had no intellectual equal, I don't recall him as arrogant. I think he was truly surprised to discover how mediocre his peers from the white schools turned out to be. And he couldn't help from shaking his head in disbelief at our gilded cluelessness. Jerome chose War and Peace for the fall book review. The unabridged version, he told us, with a paperback copy in his hands. Every page of the 1,000-page novel battered and bruised. He read his review from a typed manuscript and took most of the hour. A few days later, I rose to the lectern with my summation of the Babe Ruth story. And my best friend, Bob Watts, stumbled through an exegesis of The Wright Brothers of Kitty Hawk, a biography for young readers. And any notions we white kids still harbored of our superior intellect lay in ruins, at least they should have been. Jerome was not alone among the black children with his bedazzling intellect. I wish I could tell you more stories. I wish I could tell you stories of Walter Douglas, who, like Jerome, was the son of a clergy, but unlike Jerome, whose father was the head of the NAACP and the pastor of a distinguished Methodist church in Laurel, Walter's father was a Baptist minister, a former SNCC organizer who had embraced Black power. And sometimes in history, Walter and Jerome would lock heads and go at it over Malcolm versus Martin, nonviolence versus violence. And I just wanted what they had. I wanted that intellectual energy. So for me, it was good riddance to the closed society. And it was viva, open, honest, and free. The phrase, all truth is God's truth, is to many believers something of a cliche, and certainly to most Roman Catholics, it's a truism. But the first time I heard the phrase, it felt like a revelation. It felt like an awakening to the variety and breadth of God's truth in the world. It happened during a summer spent in a Christian commune in the Swiss Alps called L'Abri. Once a straight arrow Presbyterian preacher in rural Pennsylvania, the commune's founder had long since dispensed with the cleric's finery and moved his family to the alpine village of Weymouth to minister to all the expat drifters in Europe in the late 60s and early 70s. He now sported a goatee and shoulder-length hair, thinning and grayed in the spirit of Brando's Missouri Breaks, and a pair of hand-woven knickers that became sort of his signature. Francis Schaeffer was his name. Some of you may have heard of him. And Francis Schaeffer is often remembered these days as one of the visionaries of the Christian right. His books, How Shall We Then Live, and Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and their film adaptations and attendant national tours, the catalyst that turned the sleeping giant of early 70s white evangelicalism into the enormous political force of the evangelical bloc that we know now. In those early years, however, Francis and his wife Edith were the visionaries behind this vivid experiment in evangelical Bohemia. And I am grateful to have been there with my parents. Schaeffer sounded a rare note in the intellectually guarded circles of American evangelicalism in the mid-20th century. He called Christians, he begged Christians, he demanded of Christians that they think critically, that they read widely, that they immerse themselves in the varieties of God's great creation. He spoke passionately against nationalism, against racism, materialism, and religious complacency. And he expressed admiration for the countercultural radicals of the late 1960s. He admired their spirit of nonconformity and their quest for authenticity. The older generation hasn't given them anything to care about, he said in one of his lectures. And the student protesters are smart enough to know that they have been given no answers and they are opting out. Schaeffer's basic claim, hammered home in nearly every lecture, book, and conversation, was that divorced from the foundations of historic Christianity, humanity was left with two options: escape into an unreality that produces mysticism and solipsism, or descent into a nihilism that reduces humans to machines. He wanted us to love the world and to grieve its brokenness. Despair, he described as a closed society, an imprisonment. And Francis and Edith Schaeffer, through their hospitality, their exemplification of openness, their honesty in exchanging ideas over meals and tea and gardening, it was such a gift to so many of us. I remember in one of his lectures on modern art and the irrational, he showed us paintings by Francis Bacon and Edvard Munch, and a photograph of Alberto Giacometti alone in his studio. You may have seen this photograph, that a place that is his studio that Giacometti's friend Jean Genet called a milky swamp, a seething dump, an abyss. And Schaeffer wanted us to feel the galvantic sadness of it all. I understand what these painters are saying, he said, of the photograph. In particular, there's a communication between Giacometti and me. I feel it, a titanic communication. And I cry. And when he turned back to the audience, you could see that he really did. In the gentle tumble of his words, I imagined Christian community as a dwelling with four sides open to the world. The rooms were filled with summer light. The seven peaks of the Dôme du Midi sparkled in the distance. I believed. God lives. God is there. In the warp and woof of history, the historic righteous God. God loves. God is not silent. God speaks. Therefore, we can speak too. All truth is God's truth. became my doors of perception. In less than a decade, Schaeffer would become an unhappy pawn in the leisure-suited culture warriors who formed the moral majority. And despite his silence on, relative silence on civil rights and race, which he lamented to me in an interview on his last American tour, the Schaeffer's life and thought brought fresh winds to a generation of evangelicals raised on rapture fear and renunciation. We could trust our desires to think and to read freely. We could watch Antonioni films and grow our hair out long. We could drink a glass of wine and meander through museums. I would not be here today without him. In the spring of 1989, I finished a doctoral dissertation at this university on the early philosophical theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. A lumbering 505-page thesis under the supervision of an exacting, inscrutable Lutheran, whose lectures on German philosophical theology, however, from Kant, Schleiermacher, and Feuerbach through Heidegger, Barth, and Tillich remain foundational in the way I think about ideas and movements and persons today, and even those wholly unrelated, to this tradition. Like most church-going Protestants, I'd heard of Bonhoeffer. I'd heard his name in sermons and Bible studies, the martyr of the German resistance. I knew him as this heroic conspirator. I'd read sections from The Cost of Discipleship and Life Together. As a graduate fellow here at UVA, I had taught sections of Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison, these late provocative ruminations on a world come of age, religionless Christianity, the disciplines of holy silence, the arcane discipline, in a course called Faith and Doubt in the Modern World, which by the time I TA'd for the class had been renamed Doubt, Doubt, and More Doubt in the Modern World, and that I, in a trick of grace, would one day inherit. But it was not until late in my studies that I discovered Bonhoeffer's early philosophical theology, and when I did, it was a liberation. For this erudite Berliner, who had 2 doctoral degrees by his 26th birthday, and academic luminary, had himself struggled mightily to break free of what felt to him a stultifying intellectual inheritance. The focus of my dissertation, Bonhoeffer's years as a doctoral student and privat docent at the University of Berlin from 1927 to 1933, introduced me to a young thinker who came to experience the liberal Protestant tradition as an enervating weight as a closed society, but tried to work out in these early difficult texts a theological, or more precisely, a Christological conception of the self, a conception of identity and social relation free from the closed systems of Kantian transcendental subjectivity. In my years as a graduate student, first at Harvard and then at UVA, I'd become frustrated, vexed, as many theology grad students are, by the lack of a vital connection between my academic life and my involvements in social ministry. From September to May, I read modern theology and philosophical hermeneutics here and loved it. And in the summers, I worked in an inner-city neighborhood of Atlanta in a community building program for low-income young people. Over the course of 5 consecutive summers, I returned to Georgia, running a day camp by day that combined my love of basketball, poetry, and the Bible into a program called Body and Soul. And when the summer ended, I returned to Cambridge or to Charlottesville, excited by the prospects of a new academic year, but feeling a million miles away from the colors and rhythms of Reynoldstown. It would be 20 years before I learned, and then as Bonhoeffer's biographer, that as a graduate student and during his tenure in academe, Bonhoeffer had tried organizationally to bridge these two worlds, creating innovations in social ministry, moving into an area of great unemployment in Berlin as a theologian and pastor. What I found, though, in his early thought, as I began to make my way into the dissertation, was a theoretical roadmap of his, what he liked to call his turning from the phraseological to the real. I won't say more than 3 sentences about that argument. Christ frees the self from totalizing systems and tyrannical political powers, and from our own monstrous and idolatrous self-constructions. Left to its own devices, the heart turns in on itself, consumed by pride and despair, neurotically obsessed with control. In the Christ community, the I is refigured, structurally reshaped in openness, in life together, to be with and for the other, free to be oneself, free to let the other be free, ontologically renewed and redeemed. In the summer of 1993, we're moving through this, and we'll be there soon. While teaching at a Jesuit university in Baltimore, a place I loved, I packed a few bags into my Honda Wagavan and headed south. I had the notion that I would write about religion and race and civil rights and theology, and was there a Bonhoeffer there, and how does that story work? I had no idea what I was doing. I had no knowledge of field research or oral history, and really couldn't tell you what I was hoping to accomplish. But for a variety of reasons, I had begun thinking a lot about my childhood after having spent a decade trying hard to forget it. I'd revised the dissertation to the satisfaction of the editorial board at Oxford University Press, as you know, and I'd gone about the business of writing essays and articles in my field, as you do, in a tenure-track position. It surprised me and kind of unsettled me when I began to notice, increasingly in my journals and in my thoughts and my dreams and notebooks, words and phrases and images calling me back to unfinished business in the South. Images of enclosure, of deceit, of dread, but also images of light and openness. Being a white Southerner in those days, someone said, was a little bit like being Eichmann's daughter. People don't necessarily assume you're guilty, but they wonder how badly you've been affected. Well, there was some of that in my motivation, though most originated in historical questions that sought theological resolution. How was it the case, for example, that so many of the good Christian people, please add the Flannery O'Connor inflection there, that raised me in the faith remained indifferent, if not contemptuous, towards the sufferings and brutalities against black Southerners and the whole horrendous evil of Jim Crow. What were they thinking about God? What were they thinking about Jesus? How do they understand what it means to be Christian? In any case, I hadn't thought a whole lot about those years in college or grad school, but now, as I push aside plans for a book on the doctrine of the Trinity, I could think of little else. The church and the academy are fine without my doctrine of the Trinity, by the way. I plowed ahead into the unfamiliar territory of narrative nonfiction and historical research. For a while, it felt like a journey without maps, as I ricocheted from Louisiana to Georgia, Alabama to South Carolina, to congressional offices in Washington, and to my neighborhood in Baltimore, where I lived at the time, which had raised a community of Jewish social progressives, a fair share of whom had traveled to Mississippi in 1964. I spoke with anyone willing to tell their story, heroes sung and unsung, teachers and lawyers and business owners, coaches and clerics, black radicals and black moderates, and members of my own family. Eventually, I talked with the men who so greatly despised the prospects of black freedom that they organized terrorist cells and plotted murder and bombings. In a private dining room in the back of a gas station on the 2-lane highway outside of Laurel, the imperial wizard of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi, Sam Bowers, broke his decades-long vow of silence and recounted to me over several nights in the summer of 1993 in harrowing detail why he had killed infidels and heretics in the name of God, and why the South needed a new generation of warrior priests to hunt down the heretics and infidels of our time, to hunt them, to find them, and to eliminate them. It would take a confessing church of black sharecroppers, of domestics and small business owners to exemplify Christianity's openness to the other, its honesty about Christianity's failures and complicity and terror, and bear witness to the wide, liberating universalism of the gospel. We had wondered if there was ever going to be anyone human enough to see us as human beings instead of animals. Miss Fannie Lou Hamer of Rouville, Mississippi said of the 1,000 student volunteers who came south in the summer of 1964. These young people were so Christ-like. These young people were humanist. These young people were Jewish, like Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who became martyrs of the Mississippi movement in the very first day of that summer project. The journey in the landscape of wounded memory confronted me with difficult questions. Why am I a scholar? Who am I serving? Can research and writing make any difference at all? This journey would also illuminate for me a new way of writing theology, a new way of thinking about theology, a new way of understanding the theological vocation, and in turn inspire me to think intentionally about ways I might encourage others in their turning from the phraseological to the real. The project on Lived Theology emerged out of these explorations as an experiment in theological method, style, and pedagogy, method shaped by an attention to the Spirit's free movement in the world, shaped by an attention, an openness, and attunement to the complexities of lived belief. The capacity to turn to the past in a manner that was open, honest, and free was certainly awakened by persistent and vexing theological questions. But in a more fundamental and a more functional sense, the capacity was enabled by a realization that I could not traverse this difficult terrain until I reckoned with some of the mental and psychic barriers that had long intruded into my health and blocked my creative and imaginative hopes. The onset of generalized anxiety disorder typically begins in late adolescence or early adult life. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, classifies an anxiety disorder as persistent symptoms lasting for at least 1 month. I was 23 years old when I experienced my first major anxiety attack. But it was not until my early 30s that I finally walked into a health clinic and said, I need help. I feel really bad. It's been this way for a long time, and I don't know what to do. And began to find help in the ministrations of an empathetic physician and psychiatrist on call, and eventually in psychotherapy, including psychoanalysis, and psychopharmacology. Religious people, you see, have a way of idealizing our emotional and mental lives, and creating an unrealistic version of ourselves that in turn judges us and inhibits us from growth and from even admitting that we're suffering and need help. In the last major survey of evangelical attitudes towards mental health, conducted nearly a decade ago, we learned that 48% of all self-identified born-again Christians believe that illnesses such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can be cured through prayer alone and should be treated as spiritual problems. I had read books about psychology and religion, Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Erik Erikson's Young Man Luther, and of course Sigmund Freud's great Future of an Illusion, which remains one of my favorite books to teach. It was that even as I had developed skills of critical thought, I knew still nothing of psychiatry, psychopharmacology, psychotherapy as avenues to healing. And I too had early on absorbed the belief somehow that psychology was the devil's playground. A Christian grounded in Scripture and in relationship with Jesus Christ did not need, according to a well-known evangelical writer I read, and you would all know, does not need the pseudosciences of psychiatry and psychology. A true Christian lives in an intimate relationship to the ultimate healer. And suffering, even the torments of mental illness, were a channel through which one's dependency on and thus intimacy with Jesus could be realized more fully. Had I practiced certain forms of Christian Pentecostalism or lived in 17th century England, I might have understood my affliction to be a form of demonic possession. And in the latter case, I might have been seized from my bedchamber, strapped to a horse, and left in the Glastonbury madhouse to be prayed over by church ladies until my blasphemies subsided. But alas, I was a married young professional with 2 small children, worn down by mental distress. What I remember most vividly of that long ago afternoon at the clinic is the immediate bodily relief produced by my pleading, that is, produced by my confession, spoken aloud to the attending psychiatrist, that I could not extricate myself from mental suffering. I needed help. And simply the act of finally asking a clinician for that help was the beginning of succor, of relief, or better, the beginning of answered prayer. After trying for so long to calm the mental storms out of my own depleted spiritual resources, coming to the knowledge that I could accept the therapeutic work and the medication as God's gift was the saving grace I needed. A discussion last year with students in my undergraduate seminar on religion and mental health, a woman majoring in art history asked me how I felt about the years of living with an undiagnosed and untreated anxiety disorder. Did I feel regret? How do I think about time lost to mental illness? After some initial throat clearing, I said, yeah, I guess I did feel regret, though I probably feel more lament than regret. I lament all the opportunities for growth and connection that were blocked or truncated by anxiety's sort of capricious demands. I lament the distrust through which I came to filter all of my experiences of the world. And most of all, I lament my inability to acknowledge help or even to imagine the value of skilled and empathetic counselors and doctors. That seems to me to be the most heartbreaking thing. Each person is unique in their capacities for mental suffering and in the limits of what can be endured. That I muscled my way through 2 master's degrees and a doctorate no doubt attests to a certain measure of resilience. But I read and wrote and moved within such constricted boundaries. And yet, these boundaries would become a kind of framework and a kind of narrative structure for new life, for creativity and focus and trust. I would never want to call suffering redemptive. I would say, though, that the anxiety that intruded into my work and leisure did not extinguish the spirit of life. And the grace that saves is the grace that heals. And in my case, healing came under the direction of a competent analyst and attention to the biochemical sources of my illness and its remedies. We've moved to the final section here. In recent weeks, I've been drawn back to the pages of my Thompson Chain Reference Bible, to the King James Version, given me on my 12th or 13th birthday, that so intimately shaped my earliest thoughts about being Christian. In the fly leaves, I mentioned my handwritten notes. I wrote notes also on spiritual instruction, gleaned from my studies and from my quiet times. And I'd forgotten the importance of the acronym GROWTH, which occupies 2 pages in the flyleaves. An acronym that kind of tied my aspirations together. G, go to God in daily prayer. R, read God's word daily. O, obey God, moment by moment. W, witness for Christ by your life and words. T, trust God for every detail of your life. And then H, Holy Spirit, take control. I love the way the final letters, I can't do this, Holy Spirit, take control. These notes seem now to me like dispatches from another planet. So far has, the language and practice of American evangelicalism moved from the forthrightness and the ardor of such simple graces, the qualities of Christlikeness extolled by St. Paul, bearing one another in love, keeping the unity of spirit in the bond of peace, not being given over to lewdness. Oh, they're all so soft, so cosseted, so Tim Keller. Let me explain. Over the past decade, a shift in thinking about what it means to be Christian has changed and divided the evangelical mind. The extent of this change first became clear to me not too long ago when I read an article published in First Things magazine titled How I Evolved on Tim Keller. The article's crafty and ambitious author explained, as the title would suggest, that Tim Keller, who you may know, the beloved pastor of New York City's Redeemer Presbyterian Church and the best-selling Christian apologist, was no longer relevant. That the new and unprecedented forces assailing biblical faith require a different kind of leader. Keller, the article went on to say, may have once been effective as a minister and public theologian in an earlier era when the church sought to win educated elites through reasoned arguments and convivial exchange. Indeed, the author of the article said, he was extremely effective then. But that moment has passed. And with it, Keller's stature as an exemplar of Christian conviction. The problem, the author argued, is that Keller remains faithful to an antiquated pastoral style, one that is irenic, circumspect, and winsome, while the new political realities demand a more muscular and confrontational approach. Victory must be won by any means necessary. In her fascinating new book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, the journalist Catherine Stewart noted the popularity in the new evangelical imaginary of St. Paul's passage in the epistle to the Ephesians that calls Christians to put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of Satan. That preeminent New Testament scholar, I'm speaking of Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, expanded on this passage in a 2022 speech at Hillsdale College when he said, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the left. Ephesians 6:11 was one of my go-to verses as a young person growing up in the faith. Paul's martial imagery appealed to my competitive nature, and it's always a thrill to imagine your ordinary life as a site of great cosmic struggle. Handwritten notes in the margins of my Bible recall the summer afternoon in 1975 at my Bible youth camp in the pine forest of North Mississippi, when I highlighted certain passages and wrote in the margin my own paraphrase, "No longer bend to the cunning craftsmanship of deceitful plotting. Be imitators of God as dear children. Walk in love. Put on the new creation in righteousness and holiness, not giving way to lewdness." To be equipped with the armor of God meant cleaving to the mystery of the gospel. It meant cleaving to the fellowship of the mystery of Christ, to live in and make visible the fellowship of the mystery, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always concerning all things. This is St. Paul. This is the source of our fellowship and witness. There's nothing here about politics. I suspect that most Reformed, sort of neocon or post-liberal or whatever the appellation is, ministers, like the author of this First Thing article, would follow St. Paul in his instructions on spiritual growth, or at least they would look elsewhere for proof texts to fortify their post-Winsome arsenals. In less stable hands, however, the centrality and persistence of the armor of God metaphor gives Ephesians' exquisite account of the fruit of the Spirit. Remember that? A license to cruelty and the gloss of violence. I spent some time recently in our virtual public squares listening to the words of political leaders and influencers who identify themselves in elaborate terms as followers of Jesus or Christian that and Christian this on their social media profiles. All evidence confirms that the paradigm of irenic and pastoral engagement is over, and with it, the paradigm of apologetics and public witness, of edifying discourse and generous orthodoxy. What one encounters in this rabble almost is shocking. You almost have to go back to Romans 1 to find the right words to describe it. Despiteful, pride, boastful, haters of God. To wit, Dr. Francis Collins, a graduate of this university, a man who has publicly acknowledged the literal rising of the body of Christ as the cornerstone of my faith. Dr. Francis Collins is, quote, the most evil man in evangelicalism. Mike Pence is a disgrace and a traitor and not a real Christian. This, after the former vice president offered prayers for the ailing Pope Francis, a gesture of ecumenical kindness, resonant of the Chuck Colson era. Pope Francis is a thug who shoves our heads into the bus station toilet and flushes. He is not a Christian. This man went to Yale, and he has a PhD in English literature. Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, and a leader in Christian apologetic seminars on university campus, called George Floyd a scumbag. George Floyd, that dear troubled man from the street ministries of Houston's 3rd Ward, known to friends as Big Floyd, or known to some as Big Floyd for God, who had moved to Minneapolis through a faith-based jobs program and was strangled to death by a white police officer as he cried, "Mama, Mama, I'm through." Before this tweet about George Floyd, Kirk's various outfits received donations of $18 million annually, a staggering number, I know, to the fundraisers of Theological Horizons. But 2 years later, his organizations would bring in $82 million a year. Russell Moore and Andy Stanley and David French, conservative evangelicals, all, are cultural Marxists abetting Satan, no different than the pastors who offered their pulpits to Hitler's reign. And then inexplicably, there's more Tim Keller. This must suggest some kind of uneasy conscience with the smear campaign against the Manhattan pastor. Keller's ministry is nothing but a subversive tactic to make leftists palatable to conservative Christians. It's madness. But finally, the coup de grace, I should say the coup d'etat, regarding the January 6, 2021 insurrectionists who stormed the U.S. Capitol in a display of raw violence. If Dietrich Bonhoeffer were alive today, he'd be standing with the January 6 defendants, not the FBI agents who goaded and entrapped them. Every one of these persons has degrees from Ivy League schools or posh credentials. What do we do with this degraded language? I mean, it's tempting. I won't succumb to the temptation, but I will entertain it here, to think that these people were never really interested in being Christian, that they were never interested in being Christian after the example of the Christ who called people to lay down their most prized possessions for the sake of a new kingdom. That being Christian was always in the service of their own egotistical needs. It was solely there to provide incontrovertible evidence in support of their obsessions. In any case, their allegiance to an avenging, militaristic armoring, so axiomatic in their worldview, literally ignores every other word in St. Paul's epistle. I don't know the answer. I'm trying to figure it out. I do know this, that the church has an obligation not to join in the incantation of political slogans and in the concoction of pseudo-events. I know this because Thomas Merton wrote it in his 1968 book, Violence and Faith. The church has an obligation only to cut clear through the deviousness and ambiguity of both slogans and pseudo-events by her simplicity and her love. It's my prayer that the quaking of the Tower of Babel, which we are now experiencing, will bring us back to the clarity and simplicity of the word, to clear and edifying speech, to be people who watch carefully how we walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeemers of the time, singing and making melody in our hearts to the Lord, walking worthily of the calling with which we were called, with patience, bearing one another in love, being eager to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, and remaining strong in the Lord and in the strength of God's glory, open, honest, and free. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks so very much.